Well, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Good to be here with you guys. Um, and I'll just jump right into it. I've been a photographer, geez, 35, 40 years now, I guess. And while I'm a big fan of the singular image, I have loved working with the book format since college days. I love how they're 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 different in terms of narrative flow and what's expressed in those. And so I've had various little book projects, no major monographs to speak of, but little projects over the years. Like, I'm just going to hold up a couple. These are the first edition and second edition of a book I did about New Orleans pre-Katrina. That I created these books as a fundraiser that helped raise the initial funds that launched what is now known as the New Orleans Photo Alliance and the Photo NOLA Festival. So I love doing these. I also teach a class at Duke where it's summer intensive. Where in 6 days my students do this project, and in 6 days we make an 80-page book. And I've been doing all kinds of stuff in handmade books and whatever. But to the point of the book I'm talking about today, it came about. I'm going to share my screen. It came about because I got an invitation. Let's see if I can find the right page here. An invitation that I got. Oops. You guys seeing that screen? I got an invitation to do a show at the Life Factory like 3.5 years ago, and I'd never had anyone offer me a show that far in advance. And we decided that they wanted me to do a retrospective type show, which again, the invitation came along before COVID, but it ended up feeding into what I ended up doing a lot of during COVID, which was diving into my archives. And so started working on this show, and my first instinct was just to pull together all of my most seen, most well-known, greatest hits types of pictures. But in the end, I kind of found that to be a little bit boring. They were images that have been seen before. It wouldn't be that interesting to talk about. And so I ended up doing a thing, and I'm going to get to the book in 1 second, but I do want to note before I get off this page, it's been weird to have an exhibition up during COVID, right? We've had lots of Zoom events, but I have this page up because this coming Friday, for the first time, we're going to have a public reception. It's going to be the closing reception at the Light Factory in Charlotte, if anyone's available. They're going to have a parking lot area with a bar and music and stuff, and allow people to come into the show in limited numbers. So I'm grateful to finally have a public event. In any case, as I was working on this show, I started with this concept, and here's a copy of the book, and I'm going to share my screen in a second. I started thinking about, what did I want to do in terms of a retrospective? And, a lot of us tend to work in bodies of work that have a cohesive theme and subject and whatever, and that's how we have these little packets. But in the process of one's creative evolution over a lifetime, it doesn't always work so seamlessly, right? You might be experimenting with a new medium, or a new subject matter, or a new landscape, and those images might end up being meaningful in your growth, but end up being what I sort of call widows and orphans. They're always images that don't end up in a bigger body of work, but they really do tell the story of how you have moved through the creative universe over the course of a career. So that's what I decided to do. Let me see if I can pull up that page. Was to put together, there we go, put together a book that, as my friend Eric Pickersgill said, it talked about the spaces in between. And, a lot of the work that's in this book would probably not end up in any exhibition that was like the show I had at Southeastern Center, I'd have my Drawn to Water project, which was a very defined subject. So I tried to sprinkle in some anchor points throughout my career, but then pepper it with a lot of the things in between that some might call mistakes or failures, but to me, they were a stepping stone to getting to another place. And so I'll go through some of these here. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to turn the page while I'm sharing my screen here. There we go. So I'm going to go through it quickly. Let me actually go back. So these symbols I use as a graphic element throughout the book are the navigational symbols for the term dead reckoning, which really is supposed to be spelled D-E-D reckoning, but it's often D-E-A-D. And it's a means of navigation that's obsolete. It means sort of wandering by instinct and feel, but without use of maps or compasses, and it's just by memory and instinct. And I thought that was a good analogy for how one moves throughout an artistic journey. So I use it as a graphic element throughout the book. A couple essays in here. And one of the challenges I had when assembling this is again, I've been doing this now 35, 40 years, was how to assemble the book, how to sequence it, how to edit it. And again, I've done all kinds of things in my career, but I made big sweeping decisions at the beginning, which was that I was going to try to not show any of my assignment work. I was going to only show black and white work. And that cut out a ton of stuff right off the bat, but still I was left with a lot of material to work with. And, in any exhibition, there's a limited amount of wall space. Originally this show was going to be as big as 70 images. In the end, I'm sort of grateful that it's only about 45 images. But in the process of working with these images, and you keep editing it down and down and down and down, but you still have 150, 100 images that you really love. And that was sort of the motivation to do the book. Like, the exhibition is going to be the exhibition. But having 3 years to sort of look and ponder this, I just wanted for my own personal self to make a record of a body of work that's probably never going to show together again, and kind of really be able to fully express the ideas I had in the sort of curation of it in book format. So I kind of broke it down, I had to decide at some point into sections sort of based more or less on kind of the medium I was working in at the time. And so the early part of the book here, I think these first two images are like 1984. So I'm probably in my early 20s or something. And at that time was primarily shooting 35 millimeter, really adhering to this, the idea of street photography and carrying your camera around all the time, everywhere you went, and making, sort of the mundane images and being spontaneous and so on and so forth. And that's the primary thing I did for many, many years was that sort of shooting. But also when I was young, and this is how I had to break up the book, instead of just doing a straight chronology, while I'm doing this, I'm also experimenting with other things, lots of other processes, other cameras, other film types, other stuff. But to me, in a straight chronology, it didn't really work. So I kind of broke it down. So even though later in the book, it still will be an image from 1984, but I really didn't pick up that process again until 1993 or something. And so I used that as a sort of way to delineate, sequence, and organize the book. And like this is an interesting example of like an image that wouldn't show up. Most of my work I've done is in the American South. I would call it primarily social landscapes. But I've traveled around the world. I lived in New York for 10 years. I've gone to the West Coast, but all those images taken in those locations didn't often end up in other shows because of the way they were curated or assembled. So on the left here, I love this image taken in New Orleans of a street scene, you know, with this table that looks like someone's just left, and then this, you know, subtle little image there on the bottom, which is the chalk outline of a dog, which is slightly humorous, which I like, but the space of it. But then it's with this image of Central Park in New York. And again, probably not an image that's going to end up in any exhibition I did, but I think the way I was looking at it and the way I was approaching it, I think it speaks to each other. But again, that's an image that probably would never show up anywhere else. Another couple images from New York. Another New York street scene. Again, I did a lot of this in New Orleans and other places, and I loved this image. I loved all the things going on, the depth of space and the movement and the gesture of the subjects, but it just never found a home in any other body of work. So it was really fun to pull that in and then be able to sequence that to an image I found very similar from a New Orleans street scene. I'm gonna go through some of these quickly. I get to sprinkle in little things, like I was experimenting with these diptychs and sequences, which is ironically, again, why I like books, right? I love having two images on a page speak to one another. But I was also doing that in sequential rolls of film and so on. And then I started shooting medium format. Now, I had played around with that too when I was younger. But for me, I ended up going towards this, and I'll make this a brief little part of the story, is moving to New Orleans, I'm getting in my groove, I'm discovering the city, and two things happened. One is I discovered the work of a photographer named Michael P. Smith, who is legendary down there. And I realized he'd been shooting all the kind of subjects that I wanted to shoot, and he had a 35-year head start on me. And I was like, I don't want to copy this guy. I don't want to be the next Michael P. Smith. And it really kind of, you know, put a whammy on my head. And the other thing was that New Orleans at that time had become one of the murder capitals of America. And the most popular victims were tourists. And, you know, one of the top indicators that you're a tourist is that you're carrying a camera. So if I was doing that every day, the chances of me becoming a victim of crime was pretty high. So I started looking at what Michael had done, and he was very spontaneous, but he wasn't the greatest technicians, and the lighting in New Orleans is difficult. Overhead sun fedoras with shadows, dark-skinned folks. And that's why I started moving towards medium format work. I could be a little slower, more deliberate, more thoughtful, not motor driving through stuff. And I would try to, you know, pay attention to the light. And so with those two factors, I started shooting a Hasselblad more frequently. And it's probably still my main camera to this day. And of course, I've shot a lot of things with it, but that's really where it began, is in New Orleans. And again, this image on the right has been shown, but the image on the left, which is two parts of the same story, these are the flambeaux, the guys that light the night parades in New Orleans. But rarely do folks get to see these guys lining up to try to be given one of these things, because they can actually make money doing this. But rarely has the image on the left been shown. And one of the other things, again, I started doing this, again, experimenting with this in my early 20s, but came back to it later, which was shooting with larger format Polaroid positive negative films. And I originally started just by using a Polaroid camera with the really crappy plastic lens. And then I got some nicer Polaroid cameras with, you know, Schneider glass. And then I started getting Polaroid backs for my 4x5 speed graphics and whatnot. And, but of course, as many of you guys know, it's, you know, there's a lot of processing you have to do in the field. You have to wait then instantly, count 60 seconds. You should put it in, you know, a chemical bath, you know, as soon as possible. It's a delicate negative, it scratches easily, but when I'm doing this, this is in the era before, digital came along. And of course, now you can take a picture with your phone or digital camera and you can show the subject right away for another level of interaction. But you couldn't really do that so well in regular film days. But I found that shooting and being able to show your subject what you were doing was a really good way to interact with folks. And in fact, the picture on the left, I was stranded during a heavy rainstorm on a motorcycle trip in Richmond, Virginia, waiting out the rainstorm. Unbeknownst to me, there was a Grateful Dead concert going on and some big anniversary of the bar association. So it was deadheads and tie-dyes and lawyers in tuxedos wandering around the downtown Richmond area. And I ended up in this pizzeria with this guy who's this deadhead who had a broken arm and his head in a halo neck brace. Couldn't get tickets for that day's show. So I hung out in the rainstorm with him that evening. And what I love is in the picture, you can see the first Polaroid I took of him. He's actually looking at the first Polaroid I made of him. And so it was, it's fun to do that. I did all kinds of wonderful experiments. I love this film. I'm still so heartbroken that, we don't have that to play with anymore. These are two images that is funny when I took them. Again, I'm young. This is 1985. And in 1985, I was drawn to take these. I love them, but I thought, God, they're both so weird. No one will get these. No one's going to like these. And so I never did anything with them. But I've ended up now putting them in a couple little group shows and stuff. It's remarkable that some 35 years later, I get some of the strongest positive reactions to these two images. And again, when I shot it, there's an instinct as to why you're doing it. But then you second guess yourself. So it's been really fun with the nature of this exhibition to pull out some of these things that really never had a chance to shine in the sunlight. And it's been fun to do. And little pairings, like I love this. This is like 30 years different. This is on the left, 1984, on the right, 2006. This is some tree that people have carved their initials in over, decades. And on the right is the tomb of the voodoo queen, Marie Laveau, in the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, where people come also mark it up with offerings, leave coins, mark it up with these 3 X's. And I just thought, how your instinct, there's things you repeat, so I was drawn to these markings on this tree, and then some, God, what is it, 20 years later, 30 years later, I'm drawn to the same sort of thing, and I happen to be using the same Polaroid 30 years later. And it's interesting how your instincts kind of, once they're set, they stick there. Again, I love these sort of diptychs. Again, this is why I like bookmaking. I love 2 images on a page. I love how a couple images speak to one another. And I was doing that in, I would put these up as a singular image, in a mat on a wall. This image on the right is probably from the last viable pack of Polaroid film I had. It's a self-portrait after my father passed away a couple of years ago. And, the pack film has 10 sheets of pack. And I think I only was able to make 3 viable exposures. It was the chemistry was crusty. It was split apart when you pulled it. But I didn't want to keep this film any longer or not use it. So I had my mother help me. This is the backyard of my parents' house, and it's a double exposure and it's solarized. And I had it all set up and had my mother pull the cable release, wearing my dad's hat, where he used to work there by their little lagoon in the backyard. But it's probably the last frame of Polaroid film that I'll, probably ever shoot. And then that's sort of, I just moved to another section where it was, again, this is not a body of work that ends up anywhere. Started out, ironically, this is also my father in the image on the right, in the Grand Canyon. We rafted the Grand Canyon. But after this trip, I went to visit where I was born. I was born in China Lake, California, a naval weapons testing facility. And we moved away when I was 4 months old. So I have no memory of this. And I've lived most of the rest of my life on the East, in the East. But I was there and I've just had this lifelong curiosity. So by myself, I actually borrowed a friend's car from San Francisco and I was trying to find the actual address on my birth certificate. And I loved exploring around. And, I made, several rolls of film and some good images. And I loved doing it. But again, not enough work in an afternoon to make up an entire, exhibition or body of work. It never really found a home in another project. It's a very different landscape than I typically am shooting. And it's also a little more personal. I went to a talk by Jerry Uelsman a few years ago where he talked about inward-looking photographers and outward-looking photographers. And I would say most of my career I've been outward-looking, right? And I shoot the other. I shoot strange and exotic people and cultures and whatever. But this was the first time, I was still doing documentary work, but it was a more inward-looking project, which Michael it's what really led me to how I came to the Drawn to Water project. How do you do a documentary project that's as much of a self-portrait inward-looking as it is still outward-looking documentary? So while this stuff didn't end up in anything else, it did lead me to thinking about things in other ways. I did a few projects related to post 9/11. I was stranded in Europe on 9/11, got stuck there, and some post-Katrina stuff as well. Again, haven't really shown these much. This one's really hard to show. This is after I got back to New York City. This is an entire city block, right, of posters of people missing. And I, did it in not some Photoshop blended way, but, a very organic patchwork thing. But can you imagine how much wall space this takes up in a gallery? I mean, okay, you just lost 8 other pictures you can show. So it rarely gets shown anywhere because it's just so long. So it's fun to have this book as a way to include this as an important thing and how I love to do these sort of patchwork type things. But it rarely ever gets to be seen on a wall. And then I did my own little version of post-Katrina, post 9/11 ominous Holocaust stuff. And so I wanted to include a few of those in here. So again, now I'm playing with a new format. I'm playing with the plastic lens and the gauzy mystery stuff. And this is the final chapter, really. And Michael, this is what led up to the Drawn to Water project, because I moved back home after 30 years to North Carolina. I'd lived in New Orleans for 20 years, New York for 10 years. And I knew I'd come back to North Carolina, which I had loved and grown up in. And I wanted to find a new project. But man, did I struggle to figure out what that project would be. New Orleans is a garish city. It's very visible. It's on the street. It's loud. New York, the same. New York's kind of subtle. It's a much subtler place. And so I'm like, well, what is it about North Carolina? So I shot kudzu. I shot switchback roads. I shot cornfields. They're all fine pictures. I really loved them, but none of them ended up being what it was I was after. I shot churches. We're in the Bible Belt. I was doing fun stuff with churches. But it really was until I discovered the water project that I've shown at Michael's and other places that I hit on my subject. But I had a lot of false starts. And again, those images will probably never see the light of day were it not for an exhibition like this and the chance to put them in a book. So these are the final images from that. And that's a quick run through of that. And Michael, I don't know how much time I've taken up, but I think that might be a good time for me to stop and ask for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Bryce. Anybody have any questions?
First, can you tell us who published the book?
Well, I thought about that, Douglas. I think it is Douglas asking the question.
Yes.
I I hesitated a lot in earlier years because I'm so old school that I wanted to have an invitation from Taschen to come say, hey, we're going to publish this big monograph. Well, that really doesn't happen much anymore, right? And I could have done a fundraiser and done a larger production and gone with, some of these sort of pay to play type things, which is, very common. But in the end, it really was mostly I wanted to make it a record of the show. I wanted to do it very limited. I'm only going to print 100. They're all signed and numbered. And I just have had great success working with Lulu. And so it is just, I order about 20 at a time, and I'll stop ordering it once I hit 100, and I'm about halfway there. And, I've just had very good luck. It's not the highest end printing in the world, but I'm good enough about my color management and all that kind of stuff that I'm really pleased with the result.
Thank you.
Bryce, my name is Jay Denny, and first, thank you for the presentation. But I wanted to make sort of a historical note to your images.
Yes.
The Dead played 2 nights in Richmond in 1985. They thought enough of their shows that they later put out one of them in one of the Dick's Picks things. I don't remember what the number is, but it's out there. But the second night, the fans got so rambunctious that they crashed into the Coliseum, and the city council, in its wisdom, banned the Grateful Dead from ever coming back, and they never played here again. So thank you.
It's funny you say that, because the Dead themselves got busted in New Orleans.
Right.
And they swore they were never coming back to New Orleans. But I was there the year they decided to finally make their return. I had an ex-girlfriend that came to visit me, and the night before the concert, she's walking around with one of these little kind of hippie purses, like there, and we got held up at gunpoint and robbed. And I had like $2 in my wallet, but she had all her money and all her Dead tickets in this thing, and she wasn't going to give it to the guy whose gun was in my chest, saying, give me that purse or I'm going to shoot you. And I kept looking at her and said, will you please give him your purse? So yeah, the Dead. That's funny. Good story.
Well, the New Orleans bust, that's what produced trucking. So, it's of great importance to us.
Fantastic.
Anybody else have anything?
I would like to remind you guys, and if you're interested in a copy of this book, it's just the homepage of my website, which I'll put in the little chat here, is the best and easiest way. And what I do when that happens is I get a numbered and signed thing and mail it out to folks. And then again, I'll just remind you guys that there is an actual physical in-person closing event at the Light Factory this coming Friday, and I'm dying to see people. So if anyone's in that area and has, the wherewithal to do it, I'd love to see you there.
And as always, on the Book Talk page of the Southeast Center site, I have links to both Bryce's and Andrew's books, so you can go back and look at them or purchase them or whatever you want to do with them.
It's
I
only
guess-
going to go up in value, Michael.
I know it.
it's a rare item, right, Andrew?
Yeah. I really like that you purposefully chose images that were personal to you.
Yeah.
Rather than the kind of conventional word is having a wow factor.
Yeah.
Your images are very intellectual, and there's a lot of interior wandering in them, and I think it is just I wish more people would do that. Would say, this is what I like. This may be what the critics like, but this is what I like, and it takes some guts to do that. And I like the images very much. So thank you.
Linda, I don't get called an intellectual all that often, so that's
Today's your lucky day or your cursed day.
Yeah. I will say I did get two of my favorite people to write essays for the book. One is John Lawrence, who's the just very recently retired curator at the Historic New Orleans Collection in New Orleans, And he's written beautiful things about my stuff in the past, and he's curated me into exhibitions in Paris where I hung along Cartier-Bresson. I mean, huge honors. So I had him write an essay, and then I also had one of my heroes from my youth, John Rosenthal, write an essay. And in his essay, he talks about the images I've chosen that you're talking about as having that they were failures. And I thought about asking him to maybe kind of change that language a little bit because it didn't look good. But in the end, I kept it verbatim. I'm just like, I don't mind that term. I was striving and thinking and exploring, and if you want to call that a failure, I'm okay with that. But I do love them, like you say, for personal reasons, for my own connection to the work. And it was just one of those rare opportunities, this show and this book, to be able to show and share that work, which normally, gets kept in a cabinet somewhere. So thanks for that. Appreciate that.
Did you say you live in Charlotte now, or that's just where the exhibit is?
That's what the exhibit is. I grew up in Charlotte as a junior high school person, and I was there briefly when I moved back to North Carolina, but I'm now in the Durham Triangle area. I teach at Duke, Center for Documentary Studies, and I run the Click Photo Festival. So I'm in the Triangle now, but the Light Factory is in Charlotte. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say that your style reminds me a lot of the older street photographers. I'm thinking Lee Friedlander and Robert Frank, that type of thing.
They were all my heroes, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure they were.
Yeah.
And I do love your photos. So that's just all I have to say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bryce.
You're welcome.
We will kick it over to Andrew now.
Thank you. Bryce, it's great to share this with you. Michael, thank you for everything you do to create this community of photography, particularly Southern photography. I was recently, I was just talking to Mert. Some of y'all know Murdy Cope. She just came by to say hello this morning, and I was talking about how my voice is very much a Southern voice. And I got asked at one point to do a body of work in Philadelphia, and I'm like, that's just not who I am. That's not authentic. I am a fifth generation Jewish Georgian, as you're about to find out. That factors into this body of work that I'm about to share with y'all.
Shalom, y'all. That's right. The Southern Jewish greetings. Shalom, y'all.
Yeah, absolutely. This body of work is about Rosenwald schools, and the Rosenwald schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century. It substantially reshapes America. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience, and yet the scope and sweep of this program is largely unknown. And so with that as introduction, I'm going to share my screen, and I will share with y'all some of my images by way, there we go, of telling you about this story. So this is my earlier book, which came out in 2015, includes a number of historical images, but for this book, I decided that I wanted the historical images to be shot in place. So this is a photograph of a photograph. It's a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in North Georgia. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants in Springfield, Illinois. His parents had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home while Lincoln is resident in Springfield, Illinois as a state legislator. He rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, which he leads from 1908 until his death in 1932. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs in the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington is born into slavery in Virginia, becomes one of the most prominent African-American voices of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he is the founding principal of the historically Black college originally known as Tuskegee Institute. These two men meet in 1911, specifically May 18th, 1911. And I say that because this coming, I'm going to look at my calendar for a second, Tuesday is the 110th anniversary of their meeting. This is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt, which was created to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former teachers and former students were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs in the restored schoolhouse. Now, 1911, when they meet, you have to remember this is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South, and schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided to the schools for white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, they create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald schools. And they reach out to the Black communities of the South. And they say, we want you to be a full partner in your progress. And if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, materials, and labor. And if you will go to the school board, the white school board, and get them to, at a minimum, we welcome their contributions, but at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers, because these will be public schools. Do that, and Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And from 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute and talk about this image because it actually plays this story plays a significant role in the creation of this body of work. Most of my work up until this moment has been color. In fact, I hadn't shot black and white since I was in graduate school, but my process is to read and shoot and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting and the shooting informs the reading. For this project, I read 39 books, more than 50 white papers, hundreds of articles, and more than 50 National Register for Historic Places nomination forms. And early on in my research, I came across this unbelievable story. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on this program. And he has these photographs made of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he is going to expand this program. And these photographs of these students and teachers proudly in front of their schools, representing the hopes and dreams of their communities that, remember, have reached deep to pay for these schools, to help pay for these schools. They become a part of the historical visual language of this program. And it's because of these images that I decided to shoot this entire body of work in color and in black and white. So the very first school is in Lochapoka. They start raising money in 1912. This is in Lochapoka, the Lochapoka School in Lee County. And I share this image because everybody will appreciate this. How do you make an historical marker interesting? So I get to this place and I am standing out in front of this historic marker. And there are these trucks going by, on these dump trucks, periodically going by on the road. And I'm next to this empty railroad track. And there must be some sort of borrow pit or something nearby. And the dump trucks are relatively frequent. And I'm like, this is still like, how do you make this interesting? And I get blurry dump trucks, but I'm standing out in front of this sign for over an hour. And then I hear the train whistle and I'm like, oh my God. And so I get set up and this is how I made an historical marker interesting. So this is 1912, the very first Rosenwald School, and the very last Rosenwald School, which is in Meriwether County, Georgia, which was dedicated in 1937 at a ceremony presided over by President Roosevelt, and it's the Eleanor Roosevelt School. Now, these schools transform America. There are 2 economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South, and that gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and the foot soldiers of the movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, 5 of the members of the Little Rock Nine that integrated Little Rock Central High. Congressman John Lewis went to Rosenwald schools. I grew up in Savannah and left the South after 15 years and went bouncing around the world